In 1911, a man named Charles Whitlock descended into the tunnels beneath Lower Manhattan with a surveyor's compass, 3 days of provisions, and a single kerosene lamp. 48 hours later, he emerged at the Brooklyn waterfront, half delirious and carrying a leather journal filled with measurements, sketches, and observations that would never be published. The city seized his notes within a week. The official reason? Public safety concerns about revealing infrastructure vulnerabilities. But Whitlock's private letters tell a different story. He didn't just map tunnels, he found proof of an economic system that was never supposed to exist on paper. Today, those tunnels are sealed, the maps are classified, and everything we know about how New York actually functioned in the Gilded Age might be a carefully sanitized version of something far more deliberate. If you want more deep dives into the hidden economic machinery of American history, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover the systems they don't teach in textbooks. Charles Whitlock wasn't an adventurer. He was a 32-year-old municipal engineer hired by the city to assess structural integrity of subway construction. His job was technical and boring. Measure load-bearing walls, check for water seepage, file reports. But Whitlock had a problem with following instructions when things didn't add up. And in the winter of 1911, something about the tunnel system beneath Manhattan didn't make sense. The official city map showed a straightforward network, commercial tunnels for freight, water mains, gas lines, the early subway routes, everything logical and accounted for. But Whitlock kept finding discrepancies. Tunnels that appeared on old utility records but weren't on current maps, access points that led to chambers marked as sealed but showed signs of recent use, fresh cart tracks in tunnels that were supposedly abandoned decades ago. He started asking questions. His supervisor told him to stick to his assigned sections. A city planner he approached during a public works meeting brushed him off, saying the discrepancies were just outdated paperwork from the 1870s. Nobody seemed concerned, which made Whitlock more suspicious, so he decided to map it himself, the entire network, every tunnel, every junction, every sealed passage. He would walk the full length of the system and document what was actually down there versus what the city claimed existed. On March 14, 1911, Whitlock entered the tunnels at the Chambers Street station. He carried a military-grade compass, a commercial surveyor's measuring chain, enough candles and kerosene to last 3 days, and 2 notebooks. One for measurements, one for observations. He told his wife he would be doing field work for the city and would return by the 17th. The first 12 hours were unremarkable. He documented freight tunnels that matched city records, old pneumatic tube passages from the failed beach subway experiment, standard infrastructure. But around 2 a.m. on the 15th he found the first anomaly, a junction that wasn't on any map. It split into 3 directions. The left branch led back toward known tunnels. The center branch was partially collapsed, but the right branch was sealed with a bricked wall that looked recent, maybe 5 or 6 years old based on the mortar composition. Whitlock found fresh chisel marks along the edges, suggesting the wall had been opened and resealed multiple times. He pried loose a few bricks. Behind the wall was a tunnel in perfect condition. No water damage, no structural cracks, and recent boot prints in the dust. Someone had been using this tunnel regularly, despite it being officially sealed since the 1890s. Whitlock followed it. For the next 4 hours, he traced a network of tunnels that didn't exist on any city document. These weren't abandoned infrastructure. They were active. He found oil lamps mounted on walls still containing fuel, storage chambers stacked with crates marked with manufacturing company logos, fresh cart tracks leading deeper into the system. And then he found the ledgers, dozens of them stacked in a dry chamber near what appeared to be a transfer station. Each ledger was bound in black leather with no external markings. Inside were columns of transactions, dates, quantities, item codes, and monetary values, all handwritten in precise script, all recording the movement of goods through these tunnels. Whitlock spent 2 hours copying entries into his notebook. The entries revealed something extraordinary. These weren't smuggling records. They were legitimate commercial transactions between some of New York's most prominent corporations: Triangle Shirtwaist, Armour Meatpacking, Standard Oil subsidiaries, garment manufacturers moving finished goods, meatpacking companies transferring inventory, import firms routing merchandise from docks to distribution points, all of it moving through tunnels that officially didn't exist. But here's what made it significant. None of these transactions appeared in public trade records. Based on one February ledger alone, the tunnel system was handling roughly $15 to $20 million in annual commerce. That was a substantial percentage of New York's total documented trade, completely invisible to tax assessors and regulators. The operation was too large, too organized, and too well maintained for simple tax evasion. He kept walking. By the morning of March 16th, he estimated he had covered nearly 8 miles of undocumented tunnel network, most of it in excellent condition. Some sections even had electric lighting, which meant someone was paying to run power lines down there. Then he found the station, not a subway platform, something else entirely. It was a large vaulted chamber, maybe 60 feet across, with multiple tunnel entrances converging at different points. The walls were tiled, which indicated intentional construction, not just repurposed utility tunnels. And there were scheduling boards mounted on the walls, actual printed schedules listing arrival and departure times for different routes. The schedules were coded: Route 7, Route 12, Route 23. No destinations, just alphanumeric identifiers. But the frequency was remarkable. Multiple movements per day, every day of the week, running on precise timetables. This wasn't occasional use. This was a functioning transportation system operating in parallel to the visible city above. Whitlock photographed everything he could with a small camera he'd brought for documentation. Then he made a critical decision. He would follow Route 7 to its terminus, wherever that led. According to the schedule board, Route 7 ran from this station to a terminal point marked only as Pier 41. The tunnel for Route 7 was the most sophisticated he'd seen. It had proper drainage systems, ventilation shafts at regular intervals, and even emergency alcoves built into the walls. This wasn't improvised infrastructure. Someone had engineered this with serious resources. After 3 hours of walking, Whitlock reached the terminal. It opened into a massive underground chamber directly beneath the Brooklyn waterfront, roughly 100 feet long with vaulted ceilings. Loading docks, storage areas, a small rail system for moving freight. Fresh crates stacked along the walls marked with dates from the previous week. The engineering impressed him. Gas lamps lined the walls. The floor was paved brick with embedded iron rails. 3 separate loading platforms designed for different cargo types. Storage alcoves carved into the walls, each numbered with brass plates and filled with fabric, crates, machine parts. Everything organized, everything suggesting a permanent operation. And there were people, 3 dock workers loading a flatbed cart with textile goods. Whitlock hid in a side tunnel and watched. They checked items against a manifest, called out inventory numbers, marked boxes with chalk. One consulted a pocket watch, concerned about keeping schedule. The entire process took 12 minutes. Professional, routine, unremarkable, except for happening in a space that wasn't supposed to exist. This was active. Right now. A functioning underground economy running parallel to the documented commerce of New York City. And based on the scale of the infrastructure, it had been operating for years, possibly decades. Whitlock waited until the workers left, then documented the terminal chamber in his notebook. He sketched the layout, photographed the storage areas, and copied serial numbers from the crates. Then he made his way back to the surface through a concealed exit near the waterfront. He emerged into daylight on March 17th, exactly as planned, but carrying evidence of something much larger than structural assessments. He spent 3 days organizing his findings. The measurements proved that over 12 miles of undocumented tunnel existed beneath New York. The ledgers showed millions of dollars in unreported commercial transactions flowing through that system annually. And the terminal chamber revealed a coordinated operation involving multiple corporations and likely municipal complicity, given the infrastructure quality. Whitlock prepared a report for the city. He didn't frame it as an exposé. He positioned it as a public safety concern. Unsealed tunnels, unauthorized use of city infrastructure, potential hazards from unreported construction. He submitted it to the Department of Public Works on March 23, 1911. Within 5 days, 2 city inspectors showed up at his home. They confiscated his notebooks, his photographs, and his surveying equipment. They told him the tunnels he'd documented were part of a classified municipal project related to national defense infrastructure. They made him sign a non-disclosure agreement threatening criminal prosecution if he discussed his findings publicly. Whitlock complied, but he kept copies. Private letters to colleagues, sealed documents deposited with a lawyer, and a personal journal describing what he'd seen. Those documents survived. They're now held in a private collection at Columbia University, restricted access only, but excerpts have been published in academic journals focused on urban infrastructure history. So what was actually happening down there? The academic consensus is that it was an informal logistics network developed by a consortium of manufacturing and shipping companies. In the early 1900s, New York had complex regulations around commercial freight movement. Street congestion laws limited when and where goods could be transported. Tariffs applied differently depending on routes taken. Labor requirements mandated union workers for dock operations. These regulations created bottlenecks and costs that cut into profit margins. The tunnel system was a workaround. Companies could move goods between facilities without dealing with surface regulations, bypass tariffs by rerouting shipments underground, avoid labor disputes by using non-union workers, and operate on their own schedules without congestion ordinances. It was regulatory arbitrage on a massive scale, built into the literal foundation of the city. The economics made sense. A consortium pooling resources to build and maintain the infrastructure could amortize construction costs across thousands of shipments. Even with the capital investment required, savings from avoided regulations would justify the expense within a few years. But here's the deeper point. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a structural feature of how capitalism operates when regulations create friction. The companies didn't need to corrupt officials or break laws overtly. They built parallel infrastructure in legal grey zones, and the city likely knew. The quality of construction, the electrical infrastructure, the coordination required suggests at minimum municipal indifference, possibly active cooperation. This pattern repeats throughout American economic history. Whenever official systems become too restrictive or costly, parallel systems emerge. Consider prohibition just a decade later. When alcohol became illegal, an entire shadow economy appeared overnight. Not because Americans were inherently criminal, but because legal frameworks created such friction that parallel systems became economically rational. The infrastructure already existed in many cases, just waiting to be repurposed. The tunnels under New York were eventually sealed in the 1920s during subway expansion projects. The companies moved on to other logistics solutions: trucking, air freight, containerization. But the principle remained. When regulations create costs, capital finds a way to route around them, even if that means building an entire shadow economy underground. Whitlock's documentation matters because it's proof, not just of one tunnel network, but of the broader dynamic. The official economic history of the Gilded Age talks about regulation, labor movements, progressive reforms. But underneath that narrative was a different reality. Corporations with enough resources could simply opt out of the regulatory system by building alternative infrastructure the government couldn't or wouldn't control. And that tells us something uncomfortable about economic power. It's not just about market dominance or political influence. It's about the ability to create parallel systems that operate outside the frameworks designed to constrain them. Whitlock walked into those tunnels thinking he was mapping abandoned infrastructure. What he actually found was evidence that the economy we see is often just the visible layer of something operating on entirely different principles below the surface. The tunnels are still there, sealed but not destroyed. Every few years, construction crews break through into forgotten chambers and find remnants. Old ledgers, rusted railcars, tiled station walls, brief news stories appear, then fade. The official explanation is always the same. Abandoned infrastructure from early subway development, nothing significant. Move along. But if you know what Whitlock found, those discoveries mean something else. They're reminders that the systems we think govern economic activity are only as real as their enforcement. And when enforcement becomes inconvenient for those with enough capital to build alternatives, the official system becomes theatre, while the real transactions happen somewhere out of sight. That's the lesson from 1911. Not that corporations are evil or that regulations don't work, but that economic power, when concentrated enough, doesn't fight systems directly. It just builds around them. And sometimes that means literally digging tunnels under the city and pretending they don't exist. If you want to see how this pattern played out in other eras, I just covered the private rail networks that mining companies built across federal land in the 1890s. That video's on screen now. You'll see the same dynamic, different setting, same result. I'll see you in the next one.